Hello and welcome to Step-by-Step Acrylic Painting with me, Christine Macshane. Now today we're going to slow things down just a little bit because we're going to be creating a lovely landscape from a photograph. And so I really want to go through some of the first preliminary steps of that, so when we really hit the canvas with the colors, we know what we're doing and we understand what lies behind everything we're doing. So what I have here is a photograph of a lovely Italian scene. And this was taken by a friend of mine, so I have permission to use it. And that's important, is to, if you're going to be using photographs that somebody else has taken, is getting permission so that the copyright issue isn't a problem for you. Otherwise, take some photos yourself. The key thing is, if you can't take a photograph in a really strong light time of day, early morning or afternoon, when the light source is really strong, creating great shadows, we have to put all of that in ourselves. The second thing that we're going to want to look at in terms of the photograph itself, so we want to look at this and decide what we want and what we don't want. Now this is on a square format, and our landscape canvas is actually a little bit wider, so we're going to have to keep that in mind when we're painting. The other thing here is, it looks like we have a little gypsy camp somewhere in the background. We probably don't want to put that in. And then this is a felled tree trunk by the look of it. It could be a wishing well, but we don't know what it is for sure. So probably eliminating that altogether. And I want to do an impressionistic view of this. So I don't need to count the trees, and I don't need to, count the number of hills, as you'll see when we start to develop the painting. This one already has a strong light source, and the light source is over here on my right, and so therefore all the left sides, especially of some of the dominant trees, are darker, and we see these lovely shadows falling back away on the ground. So now we have an idea of what we're going to be painting. Let's go back to the canvas. So here we are. We're going to start fresh from here. We're going to do what we call a tonal painting. And I'm going to be using my number 8 bright brush, just because I don't want to start too small. I don't want to start with detail. And I just want to remind myself as I'm doing this that I'm trying to capture the feeling that went on in the scene that I'm trying to replicate. I'm not trying to do a photorealistic painting. So I'm going to go ahead and dampen my brush slightly. And I want to use just black. And I'll get a little bit on my brush, and I'm going to use this like I would a pencil. So I'll come in, and I want to, all of this foreground is where the interest is going to be. So I'm going to only use a very small piece of sky, really just as a reference that there is some sky there, not necessarily to create an atmosphere of any kind. So I'm going to have the background hills will be coming up. And when you do hills, I just kind of do random, unless I'm trying to completely, utterly replicate something that may be a local park feature or something that's distinguishable. So there we go. And now there's on my painting, I also have a second row of hills that are coming in. Now the thing to remember with there we go. Can't think and talk at the same time today. But anyway, so what we want to remember is, for distance, as things go further away from us, they visually flatten out. So if we build the mountains too big, then they're going to come forward. So if you're painting, like say Kilimanjaro or Mount Fuji, it probably will dominate the landscape that you're doing, unless you're doing it from a long, long distance. So generally, they're going to be flattened out and kind of further back. And as we paint them, you'll see we're going to gray them out slightly too, because there's layers of atmosphere between us and the distance. So we have to actually create that. So now we're coming down to a sort of a middle background area. And so we can actually create some higher peaks here. I don't want to keep doing this, what I'm doing here, so I don't want that. I'm going to come across this way, change it up a little bit, do my editing right here. All right, so we want to make sure that we're not creating spaces that are too much the same. Yes, just like I just did. So we can improvise by putting in a second hill here. That can help to change that dynamic quite a bit. and then that's going to come down in here. And now the middle ground, or the foreground, so the middle ground, foreground, I guess it could be a horizon line, but you know, dividing line, is kind of a sloped hill. Now I'm painting from back forward, which means that these lines will be done in their completeness. Even though there's going to be a tree in the front, I want to be sure that this side of this line matches the other side of the line, even though there's something in front of it. We don't want it to kind of suddenly start up here somewhere. All right, again, using my paint pencil, I also have another sort of a field, if you like, starting here. But I want to indicate that this is a sloped field. So I'm going to put in some rows here, which get wider as they come closer to the viewer. And so their vanishing point is off the canvas somewhere, and I'm kind of visualizing that in my head so that we get a feeling of a sloped land right there. Now, because it's acrylic paint, I'm going to be painting over all of these lines. So anything I do in here can be corrected and will be painted over, and we can correct it again when we get to that point as well. So in the background where this field meets, there is a third field, and these trees or these rows here are going to be closer together and disappear in a much smaller fashion. And my viewpoint is further back into the middle. So this is going to help indicate the distance. Already I've created a second distance, and this comes forward now because these ones are bigger. So you see what's happening there? So here we have, this is a bit of a sudden jump right there. So I'm just editing as we go. And so I'm going to put another, there we go, that makes sense now. So there's a lot, we're standing kind of on an upper knoll up here from where the photograph was taken. So we're actually seeing down into it and off rather than across a flat surface. If it was across a flat surface, we'd probably just see a whole lot more sky. So now we have an orchard here. So I'm just going to indicate the lines first of the orchard. And these are bigger than the ones that we've already done. And they've been planted at this sort of an angle. Coming out wider. We want it wider at this base than here, even if it's only fractionally. All right. Now I know I'm going to have trees in here, but I still want to know where those lines would go if they're there, in case I do have to paint them in. All right, so now I'm going to block in some of my larger landscapey pieces of the trees and the orchard and so on. What I'm using now is I'm going to go ahead and mix the black with some yellow ochre, which has kind of grayed out a warm gray charcoal color. I'm going to take some white now and mix that with some of it too. So now I have black, charcoal, and a light gray. Let's put in these bigger trees here. I want this cypress tree to disappear right through the top of the painting. Anytime you look past an object or through a space into the rest of the painting, you're helping to create depth and perspective for you to look through at those things. So let's take a look at this. I know that the left side, because I've already decided on my light source, is darker. So let's just go ahead and put that in. And then I'll use some of that middle tone color. I'll just get a little bit more middle. Of course, when I paint it, it won't be a straight line. And then I'm just going to pick up white right there. So that's what we're going to be doing all the way through the painting, so we can start to look at and adjust anything we need to do in terms of values. So let's take a look here. I'm going to do some of the same thing right back in here on the back mountains. So the left side of these are going to be where we'll get some shadows, and you can just kind of play with it a little bit. So now there's a dip down here, so this part won't get as much of the light. So I don't even have to add white there. I can just use the white of the canvas right there, and it can come right back through here, creating contours in the background. It's further back, so let's add some white on top of that to sort of really gray it out so it's not as dominating as it appears right there. Okay. Don't forget this side on the other side of the tree. All right, now we have another field. Let's put some, just a real rough indication of maybe some lines of agriculture back in here. And then we can add a little of that ochre and white and gray, and we'll continue to build some lights and darks on those back mountain areas. Really kind of roughing it out. We're not trying to get a specific shape. We just want to know that we understand that the left side of all of these contours will be the darker area where the shadows fall. Now we're coming up to the front area right here. There may be a second row of, let's do that in the ochre more, second roughed out area of agriculture, because this is the Italian farmland. And we already have that one there, and we have that one there. So let's put in our olive tree shapes. I'm going to start with a very muddy yellow ochre, which is black and yellow ochre. Now the trees at the front, anything at the front in a line will be the larger, and then it'll get incrementally smaller and flatter and shorter. And then also the spaces between objects, if they're, will also get smaller between the two. So let's start about here and give ourselves a blocky shape to indicate the tree. So then this tree here, remember we're not looking down straight on it where we see equal spaces between things. We're looking kind of across and down at it. So they're going to appear very close together here. And then by the time we get about here, they're almost running together visually. They're not obviously running together, but they kind of look a little bit that way. So let's go ahead and put this guy in here. And some more. Now the orchard that we're drawing from in our photograph is not a manicured orchard, so the trees can be all kinds of shapes and sizes. So, but at this point, I'm not worrying about that. I'm just blocking in. So I just want to know where they're going to go and about how big of a space they're going to take up. And so I'm getting smaller and smaller there. They also rise up above the area of that line because they're not flat down at the same level there. So we don't want to flatten them down to that level. Now this is a good beginner intermediate painting because if you just take your time with it, each of the little areas that we're doing can be done, especially even if you haven't painted before, because you're just going to take each area on its own and do that. So there we go. We have all of our olive trees. Cut in. Now what I want to do is just remind myself with just some white that the right side will be where the light will go. Another good part about doing this is that it relaxes you. You're not trying for the perfect end result. You're just blocking in, and it can be a lot of fun and just stop the stress part of trying to stress it through a painting and getting it to where you think it should be. All right, so there's our trees. Now, let's go ahead and put in a very light, watery yellow ochre, and that will indicate kind of where we want the soil to be. It runs a little, that's fine. Just give yourself a nice little ochre-y earth. And again, I'm not trying to get perfect coverage. I'm just kind of looking at values of, I want this to be light enough that you can see the trees. So put those in. And with your brush strokes, if possible, in any place that you can do it without looking too contrived, try to indicate any of the land contours or the way that an object is formed. So if it's circular, you generally don't want to use a lot of straight lines. Well, in your painting, you're going to want to paint in a more curved way. It helps to keep the eye seeing the three-dimensional quality or the curve that you're trying to create. Here we go. Boom, 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 boom. So there's our front landscape piece, and I'm going to use just black, and I'm going to start putting in some indication of where the shadows will go. So now here's my opportunity to create the slope of the land if possible. So let's try to get that kind of slope flowing down from not necessarily the absolute bottom of the lump of the foliage, but remember we're going to have little tree trunks too, and most of the shadow will be where the base of that tree trunk will be. So put a couple of little trunk indicators. You're not going to see every tree trunk because the foliage from the tree in front is probably going to hide some of it. And all the tree trunks should be somewhat in a semi-perpendicular, at least, fashion. They should be hitting the ground in that way. So up here, you're almost not seeing any. There we go. There's one. So let's just throw in a couple more of these. Things you want to watch for when you're putting the shadow indicators in. This is where you start to kind of take a look at it. Are my spaces too evenly spaced? If they are, just kind of block them in a little bit more, or make sure that your next one maybe is a different form or a different shape to that. This is kind of the editing phase right here. This is where we do our homework before we commit. Okay, now let's put in some of those other cypress. So I'm going to put two more. I want this one to go out of the canvas. I will then put these two further in the canvas, but again, they're up front so they can afford to be fairly big. The thing to watch for is when you start, like for example, the cypress tree, don't start it at another line that's already there on the canvas, because it will look like the top of the tree is attached to the top of that hill. You're going to put it where it's broke, where there's no line. So you'll be either in the sky or at a break in the mountain range somewhere. So I'm going to start this one right there, and I'm just going to create the shape, which is like a big lozenge. And again, I know that my sun is on the left, right, so the shadow's on the left. I really had myself. There we go. And then I'll put a little middle color in. And then I'm picking up white create that light side. And I'll do the same. I'm going to put a second tree in. Now in the photograph, the second tree is so close to this particular tree that it almost looks like it's branching out of the first tree. So again, we're going to edit, we're going to take that and move that tree slightly in our painting so that we can see it. Otherwise it wouldn't make sense in the painting itself. So now again, coming in a mid part of that line. Doesn't mean that they can't touch, but I want to make sure that the viewer doesn't think I've just spliced a tree. Using that yellow ochre middle, picking up some white. Okay, so we have the two trees. There we go. Now, scattered throughout the countryside are some smaller cypress, which we're going to indicate. Again, I've done everything with this size 8 bright brush, and very versatile brush. So I'm just cleaning it off slightly, pulling out the paint. What I want to do is when I have dried it, it's a little bit damp still, but it's not really wet, but I'm pulling the bristles flat. Why am I doing that? Because I want that edge nice and clean and crisp, just like the day you bought it. And I'm going to dip that edge, just the top edge, in paint. So there isn't any paint inside my bristle of the brush, it's all down here. It's going to make a nice clean stroke where I need it. So again, we're going to put some cypress trees in here, and I'm going to start them up at the bottom of this line and kind of carry them up over the hill, which means that they're going to get closer together and smaller as they get further back. So, and I'm tilting my brush slightly on an angle. As you see, I went in straight. As I'm getting further, I'm tilting my brush down slightly so that only part of the brush gets onto the canvas, making the small tree strokes. And maybe there's some more here too. Remember this side here, not to forget it. It doesn't have to be crowded with stuff, but it needs to look like it makes sense as to where it's going. Okay, picking up some more black on that brush. I like that there. Let's put a few more here. Let's try not to start anything from the exact center. Start it a little bit to this side or that, so that both sides kind of continue to relate to each other instead of being divided in half. So again, if you've ever been to Italy or even just anywhere in the countryside around you, you'll notice that sometimes, despite our best efforts to keep things planted in lines, they're not perfectly spaced. This might have been done as a dividing line. This one here, I'm thinking, is more of a cluster and then some lines and then another cluster. It'll save the painting from looking too orderly. We've already got lines, we've already got orchards, and some lovely contours up here. My goal isn't to have everything perfectly lined up. I want there to be some breaks in that uniformity. So I'm going to put some cypress trees a bit closer, so they'll be in the midline. So they've got to be smaller than this and larger than those ones there. So let's put those in. And they're more realistic if they pop up over the top of one or two of those middle lines there. All right, I'm just going to put a few more in here. And I just want to make sure that I'm not making it all too equal on each side. And I think we can also put in a couple of smaller ones right there. And now that keeps contained. We're not kind of leading ourselves out the other end through there. So there we have our tonal painting for our upcoming landscape. And now we understand what we're doing. We're very familiar with it. We know all our lights and darks. And I'm quite happy with everything that's in there. So when it gets time to put the color on, I probably won't be editing a whole lot more because I've already done it right here. So I hope you'll join us in our next episode where we'll put the color to our lovely landscape.